Wow, that's amazing. So then can you talk about your transition then from there into talking to Jack Kent Cooke and getting onto the Kings? I know that he had potentially offered it to you and then he rescinded on his offer and you had to wait. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, that's kind of the way it went, although it was through Chick Hearn, who did the Lakers basketball. He was put in charge of finding a hockey announcer. And I always kid with people, Chick was so into basketball, I don't think he knew a hockey puck from an English muffin, but he was in charge of finding the announcer. And I had sent out tapes for 13 years to stations, and no, we don't have any openings, or the opening is filled, or we hired somebody else. And so it was a little disappointing, but finally I heard about the opening with the Kings. The first Kings announcer, Jiggs McDonald, was going to Atlanta to be the announcer for the Atlanta Flames. So the opening was there, and I sent Chick my information and some tapes of my broadcasts and everything. And he called me and said, "Well, you're my pick. I like what you're doing, and I'm going to recommend you to Mr. Cooke that you be the Kings announcer." So I thought I've got the job. Then I didn't hear anything for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I met somebody in Chicago from USC, and I said, "Did the Kings ever hire anyone?" He said, "Yes, I just saw it in the LA Times 2 days ago. They hired a guy from KNX Radio in LA." And so I really was wondering, well, what happened to this? And Chick had been out of town. When he got back, I called him and didn't say, "I hear you hired somebody else." I just said, "Is there any update on the King's job?" And he said, "Do you mean nobody called you to inform you what they did?" I said, "No, I never heard from anyone." He said, "Well, they hired somebody else, and I recommended you. And when I got back in town, Mr. Cooke had hired somebody else." And Jack Kent Cooke worked that way, just to show he was running the show. You may recommend this guy, but I'm going to pick somebody else because he's going to be my pick. Then I heard they weren't satisfied with who they picked. So I sent Chick another letter. I didn't say that. I just said, if anything comes up, I'm still interested in the job. And then the next season, he called me and said, "Okay, come on out and let's talk about your contract." So that's the way that happened.
So at that time, were you married?
Yes, I was married and still doing Wisconsin hockey. And the way it turned out, the year I would have been the Kings announcer had Mr. Cooke hired me, they had a terrible season. And I stayed at Wisconsin, did the Wisconsin hockey, and they won the NCAA championship.
There you
And it
go.
was a really exciting year. And then I left right after that championship and joined the Kings in 1973. And we had some down years then too, but made the playoffs in my first year with the Kings. Got eliminated in the first round by the Blackhawks, but I enjoyed it so much. And even though Mr. Cooke could be very demanding and interfering at times, I stayed with it, and it lasted 44 years, as you said.
So let's map out that 44 years. What are the things that stood out the most during your career with the Kings? I mean, let's not get into this right yet because I know that's
Okay.
going to come up, but the other milestones.
Well, early on, as I said, we had some tough years, but in the mid 70s, 76 and 77, the Kings got into a playoff series with the Boston Bruins both years. And the Bruins were heavily favored to beat the Kings. They were ahead of us in the standings. And the first series, the Kings and the Bruins went 7 games.
Wow.
And if the Kings had won that game seven, of course, they eliminate Boston and they move on in the playoffs. And it was a tremendous series. And the whole city of LA got behind this because we were playing a very good team. And we were down in the series, tied at 3 games apiece in LA in game 6, and went back to Boston for game 7. And I still have the newspaper clipping in the Boston newspaper. Today is the game no one in Boston ever thought would be played, game 7 against the Kings. And unfortunately, we got shut out by the Bruins in Boston 3-0, and they won the series. The next season, we met Boston again in the playoffs. It was grueling because in both years, we had 2 games in Boston, 2 games in LA, and then one in Boston, one in LA, and one in Boston when I went 7 games. So we were flying coast to coast, Boston to LA, back and forth almost every other day. And it's a long 6-hour flight,
Sure.
but it was so exciting to be in that situation. And so those were glory years for the Kings because they had never won anything, and here they had been in the playoffs and done well, and the fan response was good. We were selling a lot of tickets at the Forum, played in the Forum at those days, and then we had a downfall where we didn't make much headway as far as success in those years. And then the big change, of course, was 1988, the big announcement that the Kings had traded for Wayne Gretzky.